Hey everybody! This presentation is all about what you need to know to write a successful literary analysis essay. Now, this is not my original presentation. It was originally created by LinkedIn user Miss Maria, and I fell in love with not just this short story, but the way she presented and organized this concept of how to write a successful literary analysis essay, because it's still an argument, just like you did in English 101, but now it's a different kind of argument. And so it's going to feel a little bit new to you guys, and this is going to help walk you through what those requirements are and how to wrap your mind around literary analysis and avoid plot summary, because we're not doing book reports, we're doing analysis. All right, so where do you get started? You get started by reading the work that your instructor has assigned. And for us today, we're going to be focusing on the story Mirror Image. And then later, you'll be looking at the story Everyday Use. So once you have read through the work, you're going to ask yourself the questions to start thinking analytically, to start thinking beyond just the plot of what was the name of the character, what did they do, when did they do it, where did they go, what's the finale, right? We want to move beyond simple plot summary and ask questions like, why did the author write this? What is the theme? What's the overall message or impact or question that this work is trying to get people to think about? What are some of the symbols in the work? Is there something that represents a main character, or is there something that represents a recurring idea in the work? How are the characters developed? Do we have one main character, or do we have several? Do we have one sympathetic character, or do we have several? Are the characters static, meaning they don't change, or are the characters dynamic and experience some kind of personal change or growth? How is the style relevant to the content? In other words, does the style of the story seem to match up with the theme of the story, or are they disjointed somehow? What do the characters learn? Do the characters learn? And what do they do with that learning or that growth? And then what literary elements do you notice being used in this work? So do you notice symbolism? Do you notice characterization? Do you notice foreshadowing? Do you notice hyperbole? Do you notice simile? Do you notice metaphor? What do you see, and why do you think that's being used? How is that being used? So these are some questions you can start with to kind of get your mind flowing on the right track. Next up, you're going to start looking at the big picture. Look for connections and patterns. How are these things related? How are the characters, for example, connected to the theme or themes of the work? How are the themes, characters, and symbols connected? Is there another connection between other literary elements that you found, like foreshadowing or point of view or metaphor? Are those interconnected with the themes, the symbols, or the characters? What does the format and style suggest about the story? Is it meant to make us comfortable, or is it meant to make us uneasy? Is it meant to keep us in the dark, or is it meant to lay everything out in front of us and make everything obvious? Look for those types of connections. And then ask yourself, what are your connections to the story? Are there particular characters or scenes that you really sympathize with, that you really like or dislike? Do you have similar experiences that you can relate to yourself? Or can you relate this work to other works that you've read or watched whether it's film or television or stories or books. So look for connections within the work and also connections to other works that you know. All right. And then the next step, sometimes, if you're still struggling to find enough to say about it, right? If you're going to have to write more than just a paragraph, if you're going to have to come up with a full-on research paper, then sometimes it can be helpful to do some background research. Find out about the author. Who is she? Who is he? Where is this person from? What was the person's childhood like? What was the person's career like? What are some of the historical events that were taking place during this time? Did this happen during World War II? Did this happen during the Civil Rights Movement? Did this happen during the LGBTQ movement? What was going on that might have been significant to and influenced the creation of this work? And then you can look further out. You can look beyond just the author and the author's life to look at what literary critics have to say about the author and the work. So did professional writers and professional thinkers like this work? Did they appreciate this work? What did they like about it? What did they compare it to? What about the author, him or herself? Did the author say anything useful about this work? Maybe in an interview, maybe in a YouTube video. See what you can find as far as what the author thinks about the work itself, because sometimes that can provide additional insight. All right. So that's kind of the pre-writing stage in a nutshell. You've read the story a couple of times. You've thought about what literary elements are at work, what the main themes are of the work, how it relates to the author and to you and to other works that are out there. And now you can develop your thesis statement. Now remember, a good thesis statement is not a question. It's not a fact. It's not a boring observation. A thesis statement is still going to be some kind of argument. It's still going to provide some kind of analysis, some kind of insight into the text, usually in terms of what the literary elements are that are significant, that help the reader see things in a new way or help the character change, grow, or develop. All right? So your thesis statement is going to attempt to prove something about this work. And that is going to be the main idea that you're going to refer back to and develop in the body paragraphs of your essay. So in short, your thesis statement is still an argument. It's just a literary argument. All right. So let's look at a ho-hum thesis statement. This is like very, very first draft thesis statement. This is really just an observation that the student has made. The student read the story Mirror Image and noticed a couple of interesting things about the story. There's a nonlinear structure. You probably picked up on that. The story doesn't really have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It kind of jumps around with these flashbacks forward and back until we start to get a picture of who Alice is, who her family is, what happened to her, how she got in this situation, and how she's coping with the situation. And then based on that insight into the story, this thesis statement says, Lena Coakley's short story, Mirror Image, uses a nonlinear structure with frequent flashbacks. Boring. We want to move beyond an observation, a statement of fact, and move into something that readers can kind of dig into with their own teeth, something that people may agree or disagree with. I mean, it's pretty clear just from a quick reading of the story that it has flashbacks and it's not linear. It doesn't go from point A to point B. It jumps around. So we want to have a thesis statement that is analytical, that is argumentative, that is something that you can prove and demonstrate in an interesting way. So how do you do that? Here are some helpful hints to go from an observation to an argument. Number 1, use action verbs. Show that the author is doing something, showing something, making something, that the story is proving something, dealing with something. So here is an example. Lena Coakley mirrors the fragmentation of her characters' lives in the structure of the novel itself. Okay, so here we're saying, that the author is using the structure and how jumbled it is to show how her characters are feeling pretty jumbled up by this situation as well. And that's a much more interesting statement than Mirror Image, written by Lena Coakley, has a fragmented format. It does, but let's talk about how that's used. And that's used to mirror the fragmentation of these poor characters' lives. Make sense? All right. So next up, how do you go from collecting your observations of a text to writing a successful essay? It helps to select 3 to 5 different things about the story that you can analyze. So if you just try to analyze one thing, if you just look at, fragmentation, it is going to be a really short essay. And if you remember, your essay for this course needs to be 1,000 to 1,200 words. So how do we get there? We have multiple body paragraphs, and each body paragraph examines one literary element. All right, so think of 3 to 5 interesting literary elements that make this story unique, that help this story prove a point about a theme or develop a particular character. Here is one example. Lena Coakley mirrors the fragmentation of protagonist Alice's life through the story's nonlinear structure, specifically through her use of flashback, stream of consciousness, and use of third-person point of view. So here we go. We've got 4 different things that we can talk about in terms of how the author uses them to show how messed up Alice's life has become, how fragmented that character feels after her accident. Make sense? So now we have a thesis statement that tells our audience that we're arguing these things are what make Alice such an interesting, messed up character, right? And then we know the structure of our essay is going to be, we're going to talk about nonlinear structure, flashback, stream of consciousness, use of third-person point of view. And now we have a thesis statement and a general plan for our essay. All right, so working through that one more time, the main idea is that the structure of the story mirrors the kind of lack of structure in Alice's life. That the story is nonlinear because the author is trying to highlight the fact that Alice's life is jumbled, that Alice feels mixed emotions after her accident, right? And then we're going to prove that through flashback, stream of consciousness, and third-person point of view, as you see here. Now, your next step in changing this from a thesis statement to a fully developed essay is you're going to look back through the work and find quotations or specific paraphrases that support the point you're making in your thesis statement. A good rule of thumb is to find 2 to 3 direct quotations to support each of the elements you're going to analyze. So 2 to 3 examples of a flashback in the story, 2 to 3 examples of stream of consciousness in the story, 2 to 3 examples of the third person point of view and how that shapes the story or how that withholds things from the reader, okay? Because you notice as a reader, you're kept in the dark about what's really going on in this story for quite some time, because you're not getting the story straight from Alice's first person point of view, you're getting it from a third person point of view. And so you have to just wait until you see how these characters feel instead of being told how they feel. Okay, so now that you've gone through the story with your thesis statement in mind, and you've located 2 to 3 quotes to support each of these points of analysis, now we can move on towards incorporating those into an essay type format. You can gather this information, gather your notes in a variety of different ways, whichever one works for you. You can use note cards if you're a note card person. Personally, I hate note cards because they never stay put. I always lose them in my bag. You can use a traditional outline. That's the goal, is that at some point you will take all of your ideas and you will organize them in a formal outline that you're going to turn into me for a grade. But you don't have to start by trying to do that. If you are one of those nonlinear thinkers, if you are one of those people who thinks best in pictures, then go for it. You can draw a mind map, you can bubble it in, you can write notes in whatever shorthand you prefer, you can write it in Klingon, you can create macaroni art. I don't care how you get your ideas organized, just gather them together somehow. You can do it pencil and paper, or you can do it on your laptop or on the Notes app in your phone, whatever works for you. But again, your goal is to go from having read the work to you thought about it and asked some questions like, what literary elements are here? How do they work? What do they show me about the message of the work or an important character's growth? And then a thesis statement where you prove that certain elements have an effect on a character or a theme. And then you find your quotes to support it. Then you gather those quotes and that thesis statement together so that you have them ready to go in an outline to keep you on track as you go through writing your paper. Now, the next step is to add research to your outline. Now, we talked about research a little bit earlier this term, and we talked about how the purpose of research is not to make your argument for you, right? Because you are going to make your own argument in your own voice. The purpose of your research is to back you up, is to support you, to say, see, I know I'm right because this expert who does this for a living agrees with me, all right? So you go out, you do your research, and you look at other people who have talked about flashbacks, who have talked about nonlinear structure, who have talked about how fragmented Alice, the character, is. And then you look for meaningful, memorable quotes from your research to add to your list of support for your paper. All right? So now that you've gathered your thesis statement, your quotes and from the story, and your quotes from your research, it's time to write the paper. Now, traditionally, we begin at the beginning. We start by writing your introductory paragraph. You don't have to start that way if you don't want to. Some people really struggle with introductory paragraphs because they don't know how to build up to their thesis. They just think, here's my thesis, here's my argument, now let me prove it to you already. So if that's you, then that's fine for your rough draft. You can put your thesis statement in the spot where that first paragraph is going to go, and then you can dive on in, okay? So at some point, you're going to have to come back and write your introductory paragraph. So, here are some tips for writing an introduction. Your introduction can sometimes, in a long paper, be more than one paragraph. However, in an essay of this length, 1,000 to 1,200 words, you really only need one introductory paragraph. The purpose of the introduction is to inform a reader who may not be familiar with the story about what's going on. So you could tell us the basic plot arc of the story. You could tell us what we need to know about the author. Does this author specialize in sci-fi? Did this author live in the 1900s, or did this author live in the 1700s? Was there anything historically interesting going on during this time period? Okay, so give us some background information to help set the stage for what this story is about and what you're going to be analyzing about it. And then your thesis statement goes at the end of your introductory paragraph. Okay, not buried somewhere in the middle of the paragraph, not the first sentence of the paragraph. Save it for the last sentence of the introductory paragraph so that you tell us about Coakley, you tell us about Alice, and then you tell us what you're going to prove about what this story says, does, means. Okay? Now, having said that, sometimes you can put your thesis as the second sentence, like right after your interesting hook statement. However, I generally don't recommend that for people in 102 because we're still working on our essay building skills, and it can be difficult to write an interesting, engaging introduction when you lead with your thesis statement. So again, give us some background information and then hit us with your thesis statement at the end of the paragraph. Okay, so another guideline for your introductory paragraphs is that your introduction should contain at least 5 significant sentences, and that includes your thesis statement. Okay, your introductory paragraph is likely to be your shortest paragraph in your essay because you don't want to give away what you're going to discuss later, right? And you don't want to get bogged down in a really long plot summary or telling us about the name of Lena Coakley's cat when she was 8 years old because it's not relevant to the story, right? You want to focus on what your audience needs to know about the story, the author, and the time period in order to understand your thesis. So your aim is for 5 quality sentences, and then you can move on. Don't spend too much time trying to write a long, drawn-out introductory paragraph. Okay, moving on. So here's an example of a boring sentence. Yawn. Literature often portrays characters who have many conflicts. No, really? This is a generic sentence that tells your audience nothing about the story, the author, or the context. So this is what we don't want to see in your introductory paragraph. All right? A much more interesting sentence would be telling us about the conflicts that Alice is facing, right? So, here are some examples of what you can introduce instead of generic sentences like, since the beginning of time, people have always loved to read short stories. Blech. Instead, introduce background, introduce important concepts or definitions. Like if you yourself had never heard of stream of consciousness before, and now it's going to be one of the literary elements that you're analyzing, it might be helpful to define that in your introduction paragraph for your audience. Provide transitions, introduce quotations, and provide facts and support. Those are sentences that have weight and meaning. All right. So, once again, avoid empty sentences that have no purpose other than taking up space and getting you to your word count. Lena Coakley is a good author. Well, I would hope so. Otherwise, why did you pick her for this paper, right? She writes about teenagers and people who have had transplants. Okay, but what does that have to do with this paper, right? Not that interesting. In this powerful short story, blah, 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 blah. I mean, I kind of see where you're going. You're trying to say something meaningful, but guess how many times Miss Bradley sees this kind of sentence every quarter? So let's skip it. All right. Mirror Image is a good story that deals with many issues relevant to literature. I mean, yeah, that's accurate, but telling me it's a good story doesn't mean much. Tell me what makes it good. Tell me what issues it deals with, right? Be specific in your sentences so that they have impact and meaning. All right. So what we're going to do next is we are going to use our thesis statement, use our mission, our argument to build a quality introductory paragraph. This is basically what we're doing for the rest of this session is we're going to build a literary analysis based on the story Mirror Image. So we're going to start our paragraph with a general statement about writing, a hook statement that actually relates to our topic directly. Okay, so we're not necessarily giving away our specific thesis statement yet, but we are going to go ahead and show our readers where we're going. Okay, so think of a hook statement as a way to say something to draw your readers in. Here's an example. Experimental writers can subvert the traditional form of the story by refusing to use a chronological plot line. We're still going from broad to narrow, right? We're still not giving away all of the details of what this essay is going to be about. But we're giving a hint that we're going to be looking at something strange or weird, something that's not your typical point A to point B chronological storyline. Okay? So we're getting our readers' interest piqued and trying to draw them in. Now let's work towards something more specific and start giving our audience a little bit more information. Lena Coakley's Mirror Image is not narrated chronologically from Alice's brain transplant to her eventual self-acceptance. Instead, it is told in a series of flashbacks interspersed with the turmoil of Alice's present. Now, we have gone from a general statement about something interesting that new authors are doing to addressing who is our author, what is our story, and what is the plot of that story, brain transplant, self-acceptance, and how is that story told in a non-traditional way, a series of flashbacks that show us the turmoil that Alice is going through after her brain transplant. All right, so now that we've got some good, interesting stuff going on, let's get to our thesis statement. And here we have a complete introductory paragraph. Experimental writers can subvert the traditional form of the short story by refusing to use a chronological plotline. Lena Coakley's Mirror Image is not narrated chronologically from Alice's brain transplant to her eventual self-acceptance. Instead, it is told in a series of flashbacks interspersed with the turmoil of Alice's present. Coakley mirrors the fragmentation of her protagonist's life through the novel's nonlinear structure, specifically through her use of flashback, stream of consciousness, and the third-person point of view. Pretty good for an introduction, right? It's short, but it's effective. How many sentences did we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is just a rough draft. Ideally, we would go back and we would find a way to add a little bit more depth, a little bit more background to bring our audience down to our specific thesis statement. But this is a great start to our literary analysis. All right. So now we've got a well-organized introductory paragraph, and that is our signpost for the rest of the paper. We are off to a good start, and thanks to our great thesis statement, we know where the rest of the paper is headed. So really, your hard work is done once you have your introduction and thesis statement done. All right, so here's an example of what your outline might look like for the rest of your essay. Roman numeral 1, that's our introduction paragraph. Roman numeral 2, that's our first body paragraph. Our first body paragraph is going to deal with the first of those 3 literary elements from our thesis. Now remember, as we talked about last time, your body paragraphs don't start or end with a quote. They start with the topic sentence in your own words. They end with a concluding sentence in your own words. And in the middle is where you use the quote sandwich method to integrate your quote. So here's an example. Topic sentence. Mirror image uses flashback to demonstrate that the past is always a part of the present. Then we're going to want to give 2 to 3 examples from the story, and we are going to integrate them with a signal phrase, and then give our citation, and then explain why we chose that quote. How does that flashback show that Alice can't get away from her past? How does that flashback show that she's still affected by the accident and the changes in her life, right? And then you're going to end your paragraph with a concluding sentence that shows how these uses of flashback relate to your thesis statement. And your thesis statement is that these literary elements mirror how fragmented Alice is as a character, how mixed up she is emotionally. Make sense? So let's look forward. Our next body paragraph, we're going to want to address our next literary element. So same thing, we start with a topic sentence, we integrate our quotations with citations and explanations, and then we end with a concluding sentence that ties it back to our thesis statement about how Alice is a character who's mixed up, just like the story is mixed up. So, our topic sentence here in this example says, in addition to flashback, Coakley uses stream of consciousness to illustrate the fragmented state of Alice's mind. Then we're going to look for some examples in the story, plug those in, explain them, and end by showing the reader how the flashbacks disjoint the reader and mirror how disjointed Alice's mind is. You'll notice that there's a transition here between your first element and your second. I use the transitional phrase, in addition. In addition to flashback, which we talked about in the previous paragraph, Coakley uses stream of consciousness. And so that helps transition the reader from one point to the next and shows how organized your argument is. All right, next up we have a discussion of point of view. Coakley also employs the third-person point of view as a method of shrouding the narrative in secrecy, but also to illustrate Alice's own confusion about her identity. And then we're going to look for examples of where the point of view keeps the reader in the dark and where the point of view mirrors how confused Alice is by showing us. So in this paragraph, we're moving on to third-person point of view. Coakley also employs the third-person point of view as a method of shrouding the narrative in secrecy, but also to illustrate Alice's own confusion about her identity. So now we're going to want to look at our notes and bring in 2 to 3 examples of when that third person point of view keeps the reader confused and how it mirrors the confusion that Alice feels about who she is now that she's had this transplant. Then finally, you're going to end with your concluding sentence, relating this back to your thesis statement about how the mixed up structure of the story mirrors the mixed up feelings Alice has. Now, as a note, in a longer paper, like a 1,500 word paper or longer that you might write in a 200 or 300 level literature course, then you might want to break some of these paragraphs up into multiple paragraphs long. Like if you were writing an essay on Moby Dick, a really, really long, complex novel, then to discuss something like point of view thoroughly in a work as long as Moby Dick, you might need more than just one paragraph. But for the purposes of this class, our essays are 1,000 to 1,200 words, so I'm really just looking for one solid body paragraph for each of those literary elements. Okay, so the last part of any good essay is, of course, the conclusion. And your conclusion, sometimes we can struggle because, well, I've already said everything I wanted to say, so what is there left to do? Well, one strategy you can use is to think of your conclusion as a reversal of your introduction. In your introduction, you started with general information about the work and ended with your specific thesis. So in your conclusion, you're going to flip that and you're going to start by reminding your readers of your specific conclusion and then generalizing back out from there. So going back over your main points, the most interesting, important elements, and how that relates to human culture, how that relates to other works that your audience might know. Okay? So the first step for an effective concluding paragraph is going to be to rephrase your thesis statement. You don't want to just copy and paste it exactly the same way you phrased it at the beginning, because now it's not about clearly directing your reader's attention, but it's about trying to leave them with that mic drop moment of the most important takeaway from your essay. All right, so here's an example of how you might do that. This is the original thesis statement. Morrison mirrors the fragmentation of her characters' lives through the novel's nonlinear structure, specifically through her use of flashback, stream of consciousness, and shifts in point of view. To rephrase that in an interesting, unique way, but still focused on the same claim and the same literary elements, we could say, because of Morrison's innovative use of basic literary elements like flashback, stream of consciousness, and point of view, she is able to produce a powerful effect that reflects the sometimes chaotic and often broken lives of her characters. So we've rephrased it so that we are kind of reminding our readers of what the last few paragraphs proved, as opposed to introducing those same points to our readers. Okay, so now we can work backwards from a specific thesis statement to a more general statement, because again, we want to have more than just one sentence for an introductory paragraph or a concluding paragraph. So here's one example. You've seen this thesis before. Lena Coakley mirrors the fragmentation of protagonist Alice's life through the story's nonlinear structure, specifically through her use of flashback, stream of consciousness, and use of third-person point of view. In your conclusion, a good sentence might read something like this. By constructing the short story in what at first appears to be unrelated pieces, unanchored in chronology or point of view, Coakley actually achieves a kind of unity that supports the development of the story and her characters. That's an interesting and unique sentence that still reminds readers of some of the main points of the essay as a whole. And then finally, end your concluding paragraph with some kind of clincher. You probably heard that keyword before in your K-12 academic career. So here's one example. In doing so, Coakley reflects the disjointed perspective of her character and creates a reality where the reader understands what it's like to open their eyes in a new body. Interesting, right? So we're still giving a variation on the same theme, but we're showing our readers how this analysis can relate to them personally, can relate to humanity in general, because this cool disjointed perspective that the author has created through those three literary elements is part of what allows us to step into somebody's shoes and think about what it might be like if we suddenly woke up in a new body one day because of a transplant after a horrible accident. Alright, so the final concluding paragraph might look something like this. Because of Coakley's use of basic literary elements like flashback, stream of consciousness, and third-person point of view, she is able to produce a powerful effect that reflects the sometimes chaotic and often broken life of her protagonist. By constructing the short story in what first appears to be unrelated pieces of unanchored text and chronology or point of view, Coakley actually achieves a kind of unity that supports the development of the story and of Alice. In doing so, Coakley reflects the disjointed perspective of her protagonist. And so now our conclusion ends with one sentence that really gets at the main point of this whole analysis, showing how the mixed up, messed up, confusing structure of the story matches perfectly with Alice's own mixed up emotions and feelings in the aftermath of her surgery. So, voila, there you have it. We have completed a literary analysis essay. Now, this is just one method that you can use. Different instructors will teach you additional methods, but I want to point out that this is very different, more than likely, from what you've done in the past. You've probably written a book report before, which is basically just a detailed plot summary to prove, yes, I really did read it, or at least I read the Cliff Notes for it. And you've probably written some kind of reader response where you have focused on your personal response and connections to the plot, the characters, the author, the theme, things like that. But this literary analysis is a different animal altogether. It's most similar to the types of arguments that you wrote in English 101. Okay? Now it's time to show me what you've learned. You are going to organize your own analysis of the story Everyday Use into a short outline and follow the same example, the same pattern that we did just now in this lecture using the story Mirror Image. So, where do you begin? How do you start? Take a deep breath. You can do this. Think about the story Everyday Use. Think about how you felt as you read the story. Think about the characters and how they feel about each other. Think about the themes or messages that she may have been trying to get readers to think about in their own lives. Basically, use those questions from the beginning of this lecture to kind of think about what the story is doing and how it does it. Then choose some of the most important literary elements from the story. Maybe characterization, maybe symbolism, maybe foreshadowing, maybe point of view. And look at how those elements relate to what you think the author's theme is or the author's message is, what they want us to think about. And then once you have those ideas and notes together, you're going to start by putting them into a thesis statement. So, I know thesis statements can be kind of daunting, especially since this isn't as easy as your English 101 research paper about animal testing. So, here's what I've done for you. Mad Libs, Literary Analysis Edition. These are 2 plug and chug kind of beginner thesis statements you can use for a literary analysis. You're probably going to tweak and personalize this once you have your elements gathered and your ideas kind of straight in your head, but it gives you a place to start. Okay? The author reveals the theme of blank through the use of the literary elements blank, blank, and blank. That's probably the most frequently used thesis statement structure I see for introductory literary analysis. Now, this other option is a little bit more advanced, and it is similar to the one that we used in this lecture when we looked at how Lena Coakley used the structure of the story to help readers see the lack of structure in Alice's life and emotions by using things like the point of view, the disjointed nonlinear narrative, etc. Right? So this plug and chug would look something like the author connects blank and blank. In that example, we used structure in the character Alice through the use of literary elements blank, blank, and blank. Okay, so depending on how you interpret everyday use and which literary elements you choose, that will determine whether you fill in the blank for thesis A or thesis B. Okay. So what exactly are you going to turn in at the end of the night? This is what I'm looking for on your own sheet of paper by the end of class. Your name, good place to start because I haven't learned your handwriting just yet. Title, Everyday Use Analysis. You are going to analyze the story Everyday Use. Everyday Use is a short story, so we show readers that that is a short story by putting it in quotation marks, same as we do for the titles of other short works like poems or articles. All right, so here is your informal outline for your literary analysis of everyday use. You can write extra notes if you'd like to, but you don't have to. This is what I'm looking for. Your thesis statement. Again, you can follow the Mad Lib A or B and plug and chug your way through it. Then I want to see your first topic sentence. Your first topic sentence is going to be based on your first literary element. Maybe that's point of view. Maybe that's characterization. Maybe that's symbolism. Maybe that's setting. Depends on which route you choose to go. So write a topic sentence about the impact of that literary element in the story everyday use. Then choose one quote that's about that element, that demonstrates that element, right? And you're going to integrate that quote just like we practiced in class last time. Signal phrase, quote, citation, period. That's what I'm looking for. And then finally, you got to remember the bottom piece of bread on your quote sandwich. Don't want mustard on my hands when I read your outlines, okay? So give me an explanation sentence. How does that quote support your topic sentence? How does this relate to the thesis? Why did you choose that quote? What's so special about it? What does it mean? What does it show? That's what I'm looking for in that sentence. Then you're going to repeat the same structure for your other two literary elements. Give me a thesis statement. How is this element related to the theme? Well, how is it important to the work? Give me an integrated quote, signal phrase, quote, citation, period. Give me an explanation sentence. So what? Why this quote? Why is it important? How does it back up your point you're trying to make? Repeat that for your third literary element. And then the last thing you're going to do is rephrase your thesis. Put your thesis into new words. Put it into a different structure. Add a concluding transitional phrase like in conclusion or as you can see or based on this analysis, right? So that's all I'm looking for. It's really just a collection of sentences. It's not a full essay. There's no full paragraph. You're giving me thesis statement, topic sentence, integrated quote, explanation, topic sentence, integrated quote, explanation, topic sentence, integrated quote, explanation, and then rephrasing your thesis. Put that on a sheet of paper, make sure your name is on it, and you're going to leave that with the sub. I will look at it over the weekend, and then I will have some feedback for you guys next week, and I'll be able to tell from what you give me in this outline, what, if anything, we need to go back over as a class next week. All right. So lastly, your reading assignment for Tuesday is on the syllabus. Make sure you read those stories and come prepared to discuss them in class. Have a great weekend.